Anybody awake?
Yeah.
How late did y'all get to bed last night? What time was it? 2? Well, we bugged out on you in the middle of the game show. That's a little bit past my bedtime. But anyway, good to see you up. I hope that you are awake and attentive enough to focus for a little bit here on the last of the 5 themes that we have been dealing with. 5 things to keep in mind when your faith is being assaulted. 5 things that if what we believe is not true, you must come up with a better explanation. You got to come up with some way to explain where these things truly and really exist. So how do you explain them? The first one, of course, was creation. The second was this book, the Bible. The third thing was the person of Jesus Christ. How do you explain him? Fourthly, as we looked at last night, this message that comes through Christ we call the gospel. As I said last evening, it is so unearthly, otherworldly. It bears the marks of divine origin because the way that God has done salvation is certainly not the way I would do it and not the way you would do it. It bears the mark of being something sent down from heaven to earth. Now we come to the last of the 5 things. You say, well, what is it? Don't keep us in suspense. The last of the 5 things is you. Let's talk about you. I mean, after all, you really exist, don't you? Again, I could say, well, maybe you're just a figment of my imagination, but I don't think so. I think you truly exist. I exist. Let's study ourselves for just a few moments. Turn to Genesis. First book of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1, first chapter. Genesis chapter 1, and let's read verse 26 and 27. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 27. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. Notice that after we have had the account in the preceding chapter of God creating other forms of life, we end this account with this statement that there is this special creation of God called man. And man, sort of mankind, including male and female, as that last verse tells us. And there's something special about this creature. He is a creature. We are created. And yet at the same time, there's something different about man, in that we bear what is called here the image of God, that God created man in his own image. Now God is a being of pure spirit, infinite spirit. He doesn't have eyes and hands and arms, although we use those figures of speech sometimes to speak of God in ways that you and I can understand them. But you do understand that God doesn't have hair and arms and hands as we do. So what does it mean that we are made in his image? It doesn't mean that we look like him in a physical way, but it does mean, as we will see, that we share some characteristics with our God. We are a being that we call ourselves rational beings. I'm not sure that applies to us this early on Saturday morning after a late night. I'm not sure how rational we are, but we are a thinking, reasoning being. We act by rationality rather than animals by pure instinct. We can understand, we can think, we can process. It allows us to rise above animal instincts. The astronomer Kepler put it like this, that we are able to think God's thoughts after him. That's a wonderful way of thinking about it. That God has created a creature that is able, has the capability of knowing some things that the mere animals cannot do. We are far more than just a highly evolved primate. There are those who would say that, well, we're just nothing but an evolved creature. By natural selection, by natural means, we have evolved up to what we are today. But I would say that the Bible has a very different answer to our purpose in life, which evolution gives you no purpose in life. That we're a creature made to glorify our Creator, and we were made with the capability of doing that. The hog eats the acorns on the ground, but the hog never looks up to see the oak tree from which the acorns have fallen. You see what I'm illustrating? You and I. There are people that live no more than like animals. They eat, drink, breathe, they do their thing, and they never look up. But we are made with the capability of looking up, considering that we are a creature, a thing made, and considering our Maker. Now let's think about ourselves for a moment. Let's start with our bodies. That's the easy part. We are sometimes called carbon-based life forms. You say, what does that mean? Well, it means that about half of us, your physical body, is carbon. It's sort of like the building blocks that everything else sticks together to. It's sort of like the two boards in a frame house. It's what holds the structure together. We are engines. We're burning fuel. You just put some fuel in your tank if you went to breakfast this morning. The sugars, carbohydrates being converted to sugars, and then they are being oxidized, much like in a combustion engine. Gasoline being injected into a cylinder, and then the spark plugs fire, but it has to be mixed with oxygen to burn. And so we bring fuel in, oxygen in, and ignite it, and it oxidizes the fuel. That's what gives energy to the car to move. Well, guess what? Your body is an engine in which your sugars, carbohydrates being converted to sugars and then oxidized. That's why you got to have oxygen to burn, to generate. That's why you're warm to the touch, by the way. You are warm to the touch, I hope. You are generating heat. Your body is like a combustion engine generating heat and generating carbon dioxide and other things as the byproducts. But the complexity of this process is just absolutely astounding. I stumbled on a book about 30 years ago by Dr. Michael Denton. Some of you may have read it, called Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. It was one of the most interesting books because Denton was a microbiologist from Australia, but he was not a Christian. He was simply looking at this as a scientist. And he started pointing out how evolution just cannot explain the complexity of the simplest cell that we can find, the simplest life form. Now that's been 30 years ago, and you say, well, Brother Mark, that's ancient history. You know, certainly we've made all kinds of discoveries since then that would undermine the claims he made. Well, recently he came out with a new addition to that called Evolution, Still a Theory in Crisis, in which he points out that the things that we have discovered in those 30 years hasn't lessened the problem, it has in fact increased the problem. And I'm going to use one of his illustrations from his book, and he says if you take the simplest cell imaginable of a living life form, a bacteria, a very simple bacteria, and you magnify this thing very, very large, that you will see complexity that will astound you. Let me read you his quote. Molecular biology has shown that even the simplest of all living systems on the earth today, bacterial cells, are exceedingly complex objects. Although the tiniest bacterial cells are incredibly small, each is in effect a veritable micro-miniaturized factory containing thousands of exquisitely designed pieces of intricate molecular machinery made up altogether of 100,000 million atoms, far more complicated than any machine built by man, and absolutely without parallel in the non-living world. That's the simplest life form. Another quote, to grasp the reality of life as it has been revealed by molecular biology, we must magnify a cell 1,000 million times until it is 20 kilometers, that's what, about 12 miles in diameter, and resembles a giant airship large enough to cover a great city like London or New York. What we would then see would be an object of unparalleled complexity and adaptive design. On the surface of the cell, we would see millions of openings like the portholes of a vast spaceship opening and closing to allow a continual stream of materials to flow in and out. And if we were to enter one of these openings, we would find ourselves in a world of supreme technology and bewildering complexity. In other words, if you blew this thing up to the size he's talking about, if this thing landed in your backyard, you would have no question that this didn't just happen. The aliens have landed. That's what you would say. This thing landed in your backyard, blown up to that size, and you have millions of such cells, far more complex than that. That's the simplest, floating around in your body right now. In other words, your body is incredibly complex. You could say it's the analogy of a computer and a software that drives the computer. In your cells, you have, of course, DNA, and that's the information, the code that tells the machinery of your cell what to do, what to produce, how to process raw materials, how to reproduce itself, how to generate energy, how does it know? That is all encoded in this code called DNA. Now, I used to do a little computer programming back in the day. I've met a few of you guys that are still doing that today. And one thing I do know, that a computer without software is nothing but a fancy doorstop or a boat anchor. That's all it's good for. The machinery alone will not do anything unless it has information, unless it has the software. And on the other hand, the software without the machining cannot do anything. The information without the hardware that it runs doesn't do anything. You have to have both come together, both the machinery, which is your cell, and the software, the DNA code that tells the cell what to do. Let me read you another quote by a fellow named Bernard Getty. He wrote a book called In the Beginning Was Information. He says like this, because information is required for all life processes, it can be stated unequivocally that information is essential, the essential characteristic of all life. All efforts to explain life processes in terms of physics and chemistry only will always be unsuccessful. This is the fundamental problem confronting present-day biology, which is based on evolution. In other words, you have to have some intelligent encoding the information in the cell for the cell to live and function. Now, could all of this have happened by chance? I mean, everything in your body is common elements. I mean, you do realize that. I think the last I saw was you take all the stuff that you're made of, it's about $7 worth of stuff. I mean, you were formed, we read, from the dust of the earth, right? I mean, the stuff in you is just common elements, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen. That's the stuff of which you're made. About $7 of raw ingredients. That's not very much. But it's the arrangement of that stuff that makes the difference. And so could this arrangement have happened simply by chance? And I suppose you could say, theoretically, I suppose it might be possible that all of this just came together exactly right, accidentally, by natural processes. But when you start looking into the probabilities of that, and some of you are familiar with Dr. Fred Hoyle, he was a British astronomer, and he gave an illustration. It would be like a tornado going through a junkyard and assembling a 747 aircraft. That's about what we're talking about here. The odds of that. Could that happen? Well, I suppose he had enough tornadoes and enough junkyards and enough time. You could conceivably think, but you think, well, what are the odds that would happen? would it not be much easier? As I said, Occam's razor says the simplest explanation is usually the best, usually the correct one. And it would be far better to say, no, this shows the evidence of design. Does anyone ever get on an aircraft and say, this thing just came together by chance? I don't think I'd fly on an airplane that just came together by chance. No, I want to rest in the fact that there is somebody behind the scenes who has designed it. And then the most complex thing, I stumbled on a book by a well-known philosopher, and I realized you don't float in those circles, and I don't either. Most of that is way over my head. But I was told about this book by a renowned atheist by the name of Anthony Flew. And in the world of philosophy, he was probably the most famous atheist. But he came out with a book, and the original title was There Is No God, and he's X'd out the word no. Because, very surprisingly, he came out announcing that he now is not an atheist, he is a theist. Now, he's not a Christian, but he was in a debate with Gerald Schroeder. And Schroeder was showing the complexity, the odds of a monkey by accident, sitting at a typewriter, typing out one of Shakespeare's sonnets by accident. And the odds of that happening by accident is far greater than the complete number of known particles in the entire universe. That's a monkey accidentally, by chance, typing out one of a short sonnet by Shakespeare. And that was an impelling thing. And if you ask this guy, what drove you to this conclusion that we were not here by accident, that there must be a God, there must be an intelligence behind this, he said that's number one. And then number two was the realization that if you could get all of this, the complexity of the simplest cell in your body, to all come together at once, the software and the hardware showing up at just the right time, able to drive life processes, then for life to continue, you've got to have something else. This thing has to be able to reproduce itself, make a copy of itself. You realize that even if it could come together by accident, if it just lives and dies, that's the end of the story. It's got to do it all again. What in the world could possibly put such complexity in this little tiny cell that it can actually, in a few minutes' time, make a copy of itself? You see the problem? And that is what Anthony Flew began to realize, that the odds of that happening by chance are just so astronomical that it's not even in the realm of possibility. And so that drove him, at least philosophically, to the position there must be someone out there behind all this. We as Christians know who that someone is. That's what we find in this book. But the thing that astounds me is not so much the body. I mean, as complex as that is. But you do realize that, well, we have two components to our makeup. We have the physical part of us that we call body, and then we have the immaterial part of us that we call something else. Usually the Bible calls it soul or spirit, but what he's talking about is that unphysical, intangible part of us. You do realize that your body, I realize when I smash my finger, I say I hurt me, but really I hurt my body, right? I have another part of me, my personality, my character, my mental capacity that I recognize as being something distinct from my body. Now I'm assuming y'all have that same experience, right? You are aware that I'm very much attached to my body. We're real close. But the body is not really me. I can cut a hand off and the me goes on. I don't lose part of the me, my personality, when I cut a hand off, you understand? And that we recognize that this thing we call usually soul is talking about our will, our mind, our emotional makeup. And it is that unseen part of us that to me is the most astounding thing about us. And that's what this is talking about in Genesis. Not so much the body is the image of God, but the soul, the unseen part of us. And that unseen part of us allows us to examine things out there and in here. Now let me give an example. First of all, with that soul, that unseen part of us, we are able to look out and to understand this universe, this created realm we live in. We've made all kinds of scientific discoveries, both, as I mentioned the other night, on the macro scale and on the micro scale, big or small. We know so much more about our universe than, say, people did 100 years ago. Well, how do we do that? How does that process work? I think, and I cannot prove this, but I think we are hardwired with certain things from birth. We used to talk about, you hear about booting up a computer. Y'all even know that language anymore? Used to boot up. They call it bootstrap ROM. Because when you turn on the computer doesn't know anything. You got to tell it what it knows. And so there was instructions hardwired or hard-coded in a piece of silicon, in a chip. There's an initial program, the bootstrap. We talk about somebody pulling themselves up by the bootstraps. That's where it got its name. And so when you hit it, the electricity, the computer knows a few fundamental things the moment it comes alive. It doesn't know much, but it's told, well, over here on this disk drive, there's your operating system, go get it. And over here's your memory, and it stores things over here. In other words, there are certain fundamental things that the computer has to know the moment you switch it on for it to be able to function. And then it can get the other stuff. You load up all the other stuff, the programs, the operating system, allow you to function. Okay, y'all know that probably better than I do these days. Well, in a sense, we have a bootstrap ROM within us. And one of those things is what I would call the principle of cause and effect. I mentioned this the other night. That we have that ingrained in us. I don't think it's learned. I think it's there from birth. And that because of that principle of cause and effect, we have the idea that when we see something happen, that there's something behind it. And that's what gives us our curiosity to investigate these mysteries in science. We want to know what's causing that. What is generating that effect? Now, how do we know there? Why don't we just look at that and say, isn't that nice? It just happened that way. But notice that we, because of this principle, hardwired in our psyche, we begin to explore, we begin to discover, and try to explain the world around us. And what we discover is a universe that is, and here I'm going back to my physics days, explainable by mathematical formulas. That is an astounding thing. And that's why engineers can build a bridge. That's why we can send a lunar module to the moon and land it and launch it without ever having been to the moon. I mean, how do they know? I mean, it's the moon. How do you know gravity works there like it does here? How do you know the laws of physics here are like that? Well, that's what we discovered, that yes, the laws of physics here are the laws of physics all over the universe as far as we can tell. And that the engineers then can design things that will work in an environment they've never been in because the math works. You understand? I realize, I see by your expression that does not blow you away like it does me. But that this world can be explained by mathematical equations. Let me give an example. One of the genius of Einstein was this general theory of relativity, in which space and time and matter are all related, and he predicted that some of the genius of these scientists is not so much the theories they come up with, but the ideas they come up with to verify their theories. And basically Einstein said that if my theory is correct, then the gravity of the sun will bend the light that comes around the sun. Right? Well, he said, here's the way you can check it. Wait till you have a total eclipse of the sun. Because normally you can't see anything coming around the sun. It's too bright, right? Can you see the stars right around the sun? Of course not. But he said, wait for a total eclipse, and you should see the positions of the stars. Then the stars come out when the sun is eclipsed. You should see those stars' positions move very, very slowly, very slightly, because of the influence of the mass of the sun. And so there was coming up a solar eclipse, down in South America. And one of the leading physicists, he had took a team down there. They're going to go down here and check this out. And Einstein just laughed at it. Said, if you're a real physicist, you can look at the math and know this is true. He didn't have to look. And sure enough, eventually they looked at these eclipses and they said, no, that's exactly what's happening. You always wonder why you got all these people in a total eclipse, all these telescopes pointed up. Well, yeah, part of it's just people wanting to see the eclipse, but a lot of it is people trying to verify what Einstein was saying would happen. And guess what? From the math, he predicted this, and it's true. It happened. And that's just one example. Isn't that a fascinating thing? That this universe works by rules, laws. And knowing those laws, understanding the logic underneath the functioning of this universe, we can then predict certain things. This is not chaos. You understand? And then notice our privileged place in this universe. We're out on the third rock from the sun. As I mentioned, our first section, shrink the sun down to the size of a grapefruit and shrink the earth down proportionally. Then the earth is about back there where that last row of chairs is, and it's about the size of a grain of sand. A little old tiny speck of dust orbiting the sun. A yellow dwarf. As far as we know, there are, the guess is today, about 150 billion galaxies like our Milky Way, containing each, on average, about 150 billion stars like our sun. Let that number sink in. You know the Milky Way? That's our galaxy, our local galaxy. 150 billion of those, each having an average of 150 billion stars. Now that's a guess. I mean, nobody went out there and counted. We've got beam counters, but you can't count all the stars in the sky. But it is an astronomical number. As far as we know, we're the only ones there. And here we sit in a privileged spot where we are able to, number one, to live. How many of you got up this morning and thanked the Lord? I know you thanked the Lord, I hope you did, for your food. How many of you thanked the Lord for atmospheric pressure this morning? Well, you ought to, because if there wasn't for this weight of the atmosphere above you, your blood would evaporate and roll away in your veins. In other words, we are in an environment that is conducive to a creature living like you and me. Our environment allows a creature like you and I, who has the capacity to think of God, you understand, to exist and to survive. And not only that, because of where we are in our galaxy, we are able to look out and explore this universe. The universe is not obscured by dust, as many other places would be in the galaxy, but we're out here on about halfway out on one of the arms, the spiral arms of this galaxy we call the Milky Way, in a spot where we're able to see and explore the vastness of this universe. Now again, scientists will tell you, well, this is just one universe of billions of universes, and we just happen to be in the one where all this is possible. But I would say, wait a minute. The simpler explanation is that we have been placed here in this privileged position to enable us to glory in the works of our God. Enables us to be awestruck at the power and the wisdom of our God. That's looking out. I want, however, to have you for a moment to look inside. You can look in and contemplate yourself. You're able to know yourself. We're a strange creature in that we have a world consciousness that we share with animals. In other words, we see a blade of grass, the cow sees a blade of grass. We are world conscious. But we have this quality of what we call self-consciousness. Some of the higher primates exhibit some features of this, but nowhere near what we do. And I mean by that we're able to conceive of ourselves as an entity. I mean, the parakeet in your cage, You put a mirror in there, right? Why? Because the parakeet looks in that mirror and thinks there's another bird in the cage with him. He doesn't have the capacity to realize when he looks in the mirror, that's me. You and I don't think you got confused. Well, sometimes I get shocked when I look in the mirror first thing in the morning. Who is that person? How do you get so old? I don't know. But anyway, you understand, once I get over the initial shock, I have no illusion that that's somebody else. No, that's me. I see myself. And I am able to think of myself. Descartes, the great philosopher, said that we have this thing called a conscience, a knowing of one's self. I think that's a good way of putting it. Not only that are we able to think of ourselves as a conscious entity, but we have what we call a moral side to our nature. We're able to understand concepts like right and wrong. If I say right, that's wrong, does anybody in this room say, I've never heard that before? I mean, I know I'm a hick from Olive Branch, Mississippi, but even I know there's this thing called right and wrong. No matter how simple man is, he knows that. You understand the language, don't you? Just and unjust, righteous and unrighteous. Those terms that we find in Scripture are not things that you look at and say, well, I don't know I have no clue what that's talking about. You know what that means. You are a moral creature. You know the meanings of words like ought, should. When I say you ought not have done that, you say, I don't know what that word means. No, you know. In fact, Paul in Romans 2 says, you certainly have this moral sense about you because you apply it to everybody else. You know when somebody does something against you that's wrong. And Paul goes on and he shows our sinfulness in that the very standard that we apply to everybody else. You know, you shouldn't have cut me off in traffic. And then I turn around and violate that same thing. I cut in front of somebody. You understand? It's different when it's me. You know, they ought to get out of my way. There's your sinfulness coming out. You understand? But you know when people treat you unfairly, unjustly. You say they ought not to do that. And what Paul says, that shows that you are a moral creature, and yet you can't even live up to your own moral code that you impose on everybody else. You know it's wrong for them to lie. You know it's wrong for them to steal, especially if you say, well, nobody believes it's wrong to steal anybody anymore. You let somebody steal their stuff and see if they think it's wrong. Oh, yeah. You say, well, nobody believes it's a crime to, commit adultery anymore. You let them take their life and see if they think it's wrong. You understand? We know what these concepts mean. And do you understand that we are then a reflection of our moral maker? Our God is a God of right, wrong, just, unjust, righteous, unrighteous. And in our unseen spiritual makeup, we reflect that image. And then there's even more. We have within us a quest for what I would call beauty, an appreciation for beauty. I simply don't see how being an artist helps evolution at all, or a musician helps you survive, the survival of the fittest. We have a quest within us, not only to see things out here, but to arrange them in a certain way that brings beauty into our life. We're able to sit and listen to a symphony. We're going to an art museum and look at the masterpieces on the wall. And we're able to revel in that and appreciate it. I realize some of us don't appreciate it as much as others. But you understand that that in itself is showing again the fact that we reflect a God of glory, that we are enabled to be able to see glory in things, in paintings, in music, and especially in our God. In our language, we don't just give signals. I've been, as I mentioned, down in Mexico quite a bit, and one of the most amazing experiences I had down there was in a Chinanteco Indian village called Usila. And we were staying with a guy there, a friend of the director at MITC, and sleeping in his shed out behind his place. And we'd had a service the night before out at the little church there. They roped off the street. We were literally meeting out in the middle of the street. We were headed up. That's where we were going to have breakfast the next morning. The guy's name is Bill Guy. He was our host. And so the director, myself, and Bill were walking up the street, headed up to the church. And Bill goes to, like that. And there's this guy over here working on his car. Got the hood up. He's under there. And he goes, whistling back. And I said, Bill, what you doing? He said, well, we're just talking. And I said, what do you mean talking? He said, well, we can talk that way. And I said, you can talk by whistling? He said, well, yeah. It's like those people there, they've done this all their life. I've asked them, how'd you learn how to do this? They don't know. It's sort of like they say, how did you learn how to talk? I don't know. I don't remember. Do you? They just grow up and they're able to communicate. It is not catcalls. It's not, man, I tell you, when I'm in New Zealand, I don't dare whistle. Because I don't know what I'm saying. We have some guy come up and knock my, you know. I got up to the church where we were meeting out in the street, and I'm sitting there with some guys from New Zealand. And so I'm saying, can you do this? Sure. It's like, doesn't everybody do this? No, I've never heard of such a thing. So I tell him something in Spanish over here, and I whispered in the guy's ear and said, whistle that across the table. And so he had whistled over here, and I said, now what do you tell you? And everything I can think of to say, they didn't say it. I don't understand it. My, what a marvelous creature we are to be able to communicate in language, and not only signals like animals can sometimes do, but that we can communicate abstract thoughts. I can get up here and describe a place or describe an event, and in your mind you can visualize that, can't you? And how is that happening? It's through the miracle of language that I'm able to communicate those things to you. And God has created us with the capacity. Remember that truth that has come in the person of Christ? He is the Word made flesh. God has created us with the capacity to receive information in the form of verbal propositions. And we're able to process those things, and we can understand the character and the nature of our God. Do you realize what an unusual, amazing creature you are? All of this points to our being designed by a designer who has enabled us to know Him and to understand His thoughts and His propositions through His Word. Now again, sin has entered into the picture, and sin garbles, as it were. It's not that the signal is garbled, we're the ones that twist it, distort it, and wrest it. But the information is very clear, and we are created with the capacity of understanding it. Now, let's get down to the main event here. The product of this knowing of ourselves is the recognition that something is wrong. Number one, something's wrong with my body. I was telling them at breakfast this morning, every day now at my age, when I get up, it's an adventure. What part of me is not going to be working today? I find that things are not falling together, they're falling apart. My hair isn't falling in, it's falling out. My teeth aren't falling in, they're falling out. I am decaying. I am running down. I am corrupting. Those are the terms the Bible uses to describe what we call the process of death. I look at my body and I realize I'm dying. This body is corrupting and decaying. Nihilists, that's a philosophy that said it just came from nothing and it goes to nothing, give us no satisfaction in this life. And then I look at my soul and I see a broken soul. I see a mess. I see, as I mentioned a moment ago, a moral capacity, and yet I'm unable even to live by the moral standard I impose on you. What I say is wrong for you to do, I turn around and violate that myself. I see myself then as self-centered, self-driven, self-motivated. And then the pinnacle of it all is that I deny the rights, the rule of my sovereign God, my Maker and my Creator. I gave the illustration the other night of the little computer blip going across the screen. And the fact is that if I have a Maker who has formed me for himself, then he has rights